Hi class, welcome to this week's lecture. This is on sculpture. I'm deciding for this lecture to do kind of a short chat with you guys on specific parts of the sculpture chapter because I wanted to make sure that, because I think most of the stuff that the chapter goes over in terms of kind of traditional sculpture, so sculpture in the round and relief sculpture, and those things are pretty self-explanatory, and I think they make a lot of sense by doing the readings. But I wanted to give you kind of a short lecture here on environments and installations and look specifically at some earthworks. And so I actually wanted to start with a piece that's not in the book because I wanted to give you an idea of how artists are kind of beginning to explore, especially at the around the 60s and a little bit earlier, starting to explore sculpture in a new way. And now you probably noticed that you can hear some weird noises. Turn it up a little bit. So I'll let this continue to play in the background, but I'll talk a little bit about it. So these are the noises that actually would come from this box if you were to see it, if you were to engage with it in a gallery space. So what exactly is going on here? Well, if you look down here at the title, this is by Robert Morris. It's called Box with the Sound of Its Own Making. It's from 1961. So I'm assuming that you can probably guess what's happening here. This box is a homemade box by the artist. He actually made it out of wood. And it took him about 3.5 hours to make, and so he recorded that whole 3.5 hours where he was making the box, and then the box itself is the piece, and the sound is also part of the piece. So this is kind of where artists are experimenting with sculpture, because here we see sound acting as sculpture itself. We also see the artist really referencing the process of making as well. And so in many ways this work actually becomes self-referential. It's all about itself. It contains much about its own process of creation in the piece itself. So it's kind of cool, and it's kind of a different way to think about sculpture, I think. And I turned off the audio because I don't want to make you listen to it for the full 3.5 hours. But if you're interested, you can actually find that clip online if you YouTube it as well. So the other thing that I wanted to mention, because I think that these types of sculpture are a little bit less common in terms of popular knowledge. So I wanted to talk a little bit about installation and earthworks. So here we have an important earthwork that you've maybe seen before. This is basically the introduction of a work of art into an unexpected environment. And this can allow the work to transform a space, causing us to kind of readjust our expectations for art and for nature, right? And so this is a piece called Spiral Jetty, and this is by Robert Smithson. It basically is a huge, giant earthwork. You can see the image that I've put over here actually shows just how big it is. It's on the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and it's basically been carved into that landscape, into that part of the lake itself. So this is one of those works that is man-made, right? But in every way, it really mimics nature. It's made out of mud, so it's made out of all natural materials, so mud, salt, crystal, rocks, and water. So these elements are kind of they're basically like brought into the space, dug up in certain ways, and then brought into the space and put into this kind of spiral design. So the spiral shape is one, as I've said, that is completely exists in nature already, and so this is what the artist is interested in as he creates a work which is completely man-made, but he's really looking to natural forms when he's thinking through the design that he wanted to create. And another important thing about this work that I like to mention is that it changes. So not only is it an earthwork, or an environment, this is what your book also calls an environment, but it also could be talked about in terms of a time-based work, okay? So you can think about how it changes over time, so it's constantly changing. And here are some kind of pictures to show you the changes it goes through throughout the year. So as I said, it's on the Great Salt Lake, and so there's a lot of salt in that lake. And at sometimes in the year, the salt deposits completely cover the spiral jetty. So you can see that over here. At other points in the year, the tide makes it so that all the clay at the bottom of the lake comes to the surface. So you can see the image over at the right where the water actually looks quite orange and kind of a clay, a reddish color. And then here you can see again that kind of clay reddish color where the spiral jetty itself has really thick salt deposits on it. And then over here you see the piece in the winter time. So when the lake has frozen over at the edges and you see all the snow covering the spiral jetty. I also want to point out this little man here. This is how big it is, right? You could actually drive a truck out on there. So it's actually quite gigantic. And so this is a great example of an earthwork, or what we call an environment. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Cloudgate in Chicago to get us thinking about installation and site specificity. All right, so the Cloudgate, it's in Chicago. Some of you may have seen it before. It's also been called the Bean. And it's this massive sculpture which actually appears weightless, right? Despite the fact that it actually weighs about 100 tons. Because of the form, because of its form and somewhat weightless, it seems light, right? It almost seems like kind of a balloon of sorts. But it's actually, this gigantic piece. You can actually see it just how small people are next to it. And what it does is it basically reflects its surroundings. And so actually the artist would say, Anish Kapoor would say that this piece could not go anywhere else. And this is how we think about installations and site specificity. So this is an installation. It's been installed into a space. So anytime you have objects or a piece itself which are taken to a specific place and installed there, that is called an installation artwork. And we can also say that this is a site-specific work, and that is because the artist would say that this piece needs to be in Chicago, reflecting the Chicago skyline. And so if you know Chicago, this is, the Chicago is it's right on the lake, and so half of this would reflect like the cityscape, and then the other side would reflect kind of the lake. So it's right in between the two. So it needs that space, and that is integral to what the work looks like. And if you were to go underneath it like these people are here, and you look up, you can see something like this. So it's kind of morphs your image. So people really enjoy when they go there. I've been here multiple times because I'm from up north. And when you go there, it's just tourists are just obsessed with this piece, taking pictures of themselves in it. And I did a quick Google search for it, and it looks like, the first things that come up are a series of selfies, right? So everybody really loves to take selfies in front of the Cloudgate in Chicago. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about were living sculptures, and a couple different ways we see this happening. So people can be living sculptures if they're performing, right? And so here we have the performing artist Yoko Ono. You might know her for for the fact that she was married to John Lennon, one of the Beatles. And you might not even have known that she was a performing artist, but actually before she even met John Lennon, she was a pretty famous and well-known performing artist, and a really great performing artist, I would say as well. So basically this work was called Cut Piece, and it challenged the neutrality of the relationship between the viewer and the art. Oftentimes we think about art as something that we don't really engage with. We think about it as something that is on the wall, probably framed in some sort of frame. a canvas that's been enframed of some sort in some way. But we don't think of it as a relationship between the viewer and art. We don't think of it certainly as um, a performance that can actually talk back to us, right? And can actually engage with us in certain ways. So here you see what this piece is actually doing is she had invited people to this performance, and it's called Cut Piece. And so she came fully clothed, and she invited people in the audience to come up to her, and there was scissors sitting next to her, and they would take the scissors and then cut part of her clothes off. And every person was able to cut a little by little by little off until she was eventually down in her underwear. And so the viewer becomes implicated in the potentially aggressive act of unveiling the female body. So it's all about feminism as well, and this kind of sacredity of the female body, um, which served historically as a neutral subject for art. So as we go through the course, we'll talk a little bit later on when we think more about the history of art, about how we see the female body often represented as nude or as potentially kind of a subject of desire. And this happens a lot within art. But here she's kind of challenging that historical example and saying that the female body does not have to be a neutral subject for art, but rather, she can be much more than that through this piece. I also really like to bring this one up when we talk about performance art, as the body becomes sculpture. So this piece is by Marina Abramovich, and it's a performance piece, and they primarily use their bodies. So the bodies almost become sculptures in certain ways. So what happened here? Well, you can see this is just a kind of still of the performance itself, which was a pretty long performance. I think it was 90 minutes long, so about an hour and a half. And here, these two artists, they stood naked and less than a foot apart at the entrance to a gallery. So people had to choose as they came in, people had to choose which body to face, a male or a female's body, naked body, as they passed through the door. And you can see this man here is choosing to face Marina as he enters the room, and the performers just stay there and look at each other. So it's all about kind of like preference and, seeing how people respond to kind of the naked body in public, right? So this is really important. And in fact, it was so controversial that these two people would be in public naked, right? Even though it's an artwork. It was so controversial that it was halted after 90 minutes. It was actually supposed to be a much longer piece, but the police were called and brought in, and they had to stop the piece. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of performance art and the body as kind of an active sculpture is what we call happenings. So these are basically a moment in which artists do something, right? They make something happen. And here we have the artist Janine Antoni, who's one of my very favorite artists. I'll move this over. And she did this piece called Loving Care. And she basically, as you can see here, she used the empty gallery space, and she dipped her hair in hair dye. So this is a pail of hair dye, and then she just basically rubbed it all over the floor, like she was mopping the floor with her hair full of this dye. And you can see the finished room is over here, and then we have kind of a performance piece over here where she's actually doing the work. And so this would actually be the work itself, is the documentation of the piece. And so here again, she's challenging the relationship between the work and the audience. The audience, as you can see, all their feet right behind her, they have to move and move and move back as she moves back, and eventually edges them out of the gallery space. And then here is kind of what we have at the end, and you can see that the reflection of people looking in, right? Because you can't really enter the space once it's been painted like this. And we also get to think about the artist's body in motion, right? How the artist's body becomes a paintbrush in certain ways. When we think about this piece, how her hair becomes a paintbrush is really important here. All right, and then the very last thing that I wanted to get at today was happenings. So happenings are basically invented by Alan Capro. He was an important artist who was working in the 60s. And this is basically partly improvisation between people. Okay, so he was interested in spontaneity as important to a piece of art. So he also had a theater background, so he was interested. That's why we kind of clump it in with performance art because it's completely theatrical, it's completely performative, but it's actually a happening, right? It's an invented happening. And this typically involved audience participation. And he was quoted in saying that happenings were something spontaneous, something that just happened to happen, end quote. And these were very much inspired by the work of Jackson Pollock, who we talked about in prior lectures when we talked about painting. And remember, Jackson Pollock, he was the painter he created drip paintings, where he would literally kind of just throw paint onto his canvas, dripping it in certain ways and pouring it out of canisters. But he was really interested in chance and spontaneity, right? He was interested in the way that gravity moved the paint from, his utensil to the canvas, which he would have spread down on the floor. And so Alan Capro and the people who were interested in happenings also had the belief that art could be brought into the realm of everyday life. And so they did things like this. Basically, people would be invited to a happening, and they would be invited to be part of the piece. These aren't artists per se, but they are just people who are invited by an artist who has the idea for the happening to do something. So here we have an artwork by Alan Capro, a happening, something that just happens to happen, as he would say, called Household from 1964. And you can see Household involves only participants, no spectators. So if you came to this piece and you decided you just wanted to watch, you would be asked to leave because you had to be participating. There were no spectators allowed. So as you can see, here you can see women in the background who are building a nest. And then here in the foreground, you have people licking jam off a wrecked car. And then men eventually destroyed the car with sledgehammers. So it's actually a complete kind of performative act that takes place over time. And you can see this is just a video, a still of the part of the performance. But what's important here is that this is a happening, right? All these people, none of them are artists. They all came together and did kind of things spontaneously as they saw fit. So, these women and these men licked the car in different ways, in different patterns, smearing the jam across the outside of the jar in no particular fashion, right? It's somewhat random. And that's what the artist Alan Capro and many other artists who were interested in happenings in the 60s were really wanting to get at with their work. And we would call this sculpture, but we would call it more so a sculpture of the performative kind of sculpture, which uses the body. And so that's kind of all for today's lecture, just because I thought that these last few types of sculpture might leave you with some questions. So I wanted to give you a short lecture there. I'll see you next week where I'm hoping to load a lecture on Tuesday and hopefully on Thursday about the material. All right, have a good weekend.